Ladies and gentlemen, when an empath walks away, something powerful happens. Not just in the relationship, but in the unseen psychological structure of the one who depended on them. To understand this, you must first understand the nature of empathy. An empath does not merely feel emotions, they absorb, interpret, and often carry the emotional burdens of others. They nurture, they accommodate, they sacrifice. But when empathy is given without wisdom, it becomes a resource that can be exploited to understand what truly happens when an empath walks away. You must first understand the psychological difference between empathy and narcissism. These are not just personality labels. They represent two completely different emotional operating systems. An empath is wired to connect. Their emotional intelligence is naturally attuned to the moods, needs, and unspoken signals of others. They don't just hear words, they feel tone. They don't just observe behavior, they sense intention. This heightened sensitivity makes them compassionate, forgiving, and often incredibly patient. They look for the good, they give second chances. They try to understand before they judge. Their strength lies in their capacity to care deeply. But that same strength, without awareness, can become vulnerability. Now contrast that with the narcissistic emotional structure. At its core, narcissism is not about confidence. It is about compensation. It is a fragile ego wrapped in grandiosity. It survives on external validation because internally it lacks stable self-worth. Where the empath seeks connection, the narcissist seeks control. Where the empath gives energy, the narcissist extracts energy. Where the empath wants mutual understanding, the narcissist wants dominance. The empath asks, how can we fix this? The narcissist asks, how can I win this? This is why these two personalities often collide and bond in the first place. The empath sees pain behind arrogance and wants to heal it. The narcissist sees generosity and wants to harness it. The empath gives emotional supply freely. The narcissist consumes it strategically. In the beginning, the connection can feel intense, almost magnetic. The narcissist mirrors the empath's values, dreams, and emotions. This creates the illusion of deep compatibility. The empath feels seen. The narcissist feels empowered. But here is the hidden dynamic. The narcissist is studying what moves you. They are identifying what makes you react, what makes you stay, what makes you forgive. Because for them, emotional reaction equals control. The empath, on the other hand, believes love is proven through endurance. They tolerate disrespect, thinking patience will inspire change. They over-explain, hoping clarity will produce accountability. They sacrifice boundaries, believing compassion will heal insecurity. But empathy does not cure narcissism. And this is the painful education many empaths must go through. You see, empathy operates from abundance. It believes love multiplies when shared. Narcissism operates from scarcity. It believes power increases when others are diminished. So while the empath is trying to build emotional safety, the narcissist is testing emotional leverage. This is why the relationship often feels confusing. The empath gives more when things feel unstable. The narcissist withdraws or escalates to regain dominance. It becomes a cycle: pursuit and distance, validation and devaluation, affection and control. Psychologically, the empath becomes emotionally invested in restoring harmony. The narcissist becomes invested in maintaining superiority. Now here is the critical truth. The narcissist does not attach to you in the same way you attach to them. You attach through meaning. They attach through utility. You see shared history. They see emotional access. You remember promises. They remember leverage points. That difference changes everything. Because when conflict happens, the empath feels heartbreak. The narcissist feels threatened ego. When distance occurs, the empath feels loss. The narcissist feels loss of influence. When silence falls, the empath feels grief. The narcissist feels withdrawal from supply. Understanding this distinction is not about hatred. It is about clarity. Empathy is relational strength. Narcissism is relational strategy. One is driven by emotional depth. The other is driven by psychological positioning. And when you finally understand that you were loving from sincerity while the other was operating from control, you stop personalizing the dysfunction. You stop asking, why wasn't I enough? And start realizing it was never about enough. It was about power. This awareness is transformative because once the empath recognizes the difference between genuine connection and ego dependency, they stop overextending themselves trying to fix what was never designed to be mutual. They begin to see that empathy must be paired with boundaries, that compassion must be balanced with discernment, that love without self-respect becomes self-abandonment. The narcissist thrives in emotional chaos because chaos keeps the empath engaged, but clarity disrupts that system. And when clarity enters the empath's mind, control begins to lose its grip. The empath no longer reacts impulsively. They observe, they analyze, they detach strategically. And that shift from emotional absorption to emotional awareness is the beginning of psychological freedom. You cannot change the emotional architecture of someone who refuses introspection, but you can change your access to them. And that is where power shifts. When you understand the fundamental difference between empathy and narcissism, you stop trying to transform the other person and start transforming your response. You stop negotiating your worth. You stop explaining your boundaries repeatedly. You stop confusing intensity with intimacy. Instead, you elevate. And elevation always begins with understanding. Because when knowledge replaces confusion, strength replaces desperation. When awareness replaces illusion, dignity replaces pleading. And once an empath reaches that level of awareness, walking away is no longer an emotional reaction. It becomes an informed decision. Control is the central currency in a narcissistic dynamic. It is not affection that sustains it. It is not companionship. It is not partnership. It is control. Many people misunderstand this because the surface presentation can look like passion, intensity, or even deep attachment. But beneath the surface, what is really being protected is dominance over emotional direction. The narcissistic mindset does not ask, "How can I love you better?" It asks, "How can I secure my position in your emotional world?" That distinction changes everything. Control operates subtly at first. It may come disguised as guidance, as protection, as strong opinions about what is best for you. Over time, it becomes criticism that shapes your behavior, silence that punishes you, praise that conditions you, and withdrawal that destabilizes you. This is not random behavior. It is strategic. When your mood depends on their approval, when your peace depends on their response, when your confidence rises and falls based on their validation, control has been successfully established. Validation in this system becomes oxygen. The narcissistic ego is constructed outwardly. It relies on mirrors. It relies on applause. It relies on reaction. Even conflict can be fuel because it proves significance. If they can make you angry, they can still move you. If they can make you cry, they still influence you. If they can make you explain yourself repeatedly, they still command your emotional energy. The goal is not harmony. The goal is dominance over your internal climate. This is why empathy becomes such a powerful resource. An empath seeks understanding. They want resolution. They want clarity. They want healing conversations. But in a control-based dynamic, those healthy desires are exploited. The empath keeps trying to fix what was never designed to be fixed. They keep giving emotional access to someone who uses that access to recalibrate power. The narcissistic need for validation is constant because the internal foundation is unstable. True confidence is self-sustaining. It does not panic when someone disagrees. It does not collapse when someone leaves. But borrowed confidence, confidence built on external admiration, must constantly be refueled. That is why attention, praise, admiration, and even fear are so critical in this structure. When validation disappears, anxiety increases. When admiration fades, insecurity surfaces. When the empath stops reacting, the illusion begins to weaken. Understanding this shifts the narrative. The empath often believes the conflict is about communication issues, misunderstandings, or emotional differences. But the deeper issue is power distribution. Who controls the emotional temperature of the relationship? Who dictates when peace exists? Who decides when affection is given or withdrawn? If one person holds that authority, the dynamic is imbalanced. When an empath recognizes that control, not love, has been the driving force, clarity emerges. And clarity is dangerous to manipulation. Because once you see the pattern, you can no longer participate in it unconsciously. You begin to detach not from emotion, but from dependency on validation. You stop seeking approval from someone who needs your insecurity to feel secure. At that point, the narcissistic structure begins to shake, not because of anger, not because of confrontation, but because the supply line is weakening. Validation is no longer automatic. Emotional reactions are no longer guaranteed. The empath's awareness becomes a form of silent resistance, and resistance to control feels like threat to someone whose identity is rooted in dominance. The most transformative moment in this entire dynamic is not the argument. It is not the exposure. It is the boundary. A boundary says, you can have your emotions, but you cannot control mine. A boundary says, you can disagree, but you cannot diminish. A boundary says, you can exist, but you cannot define me. That is the moment the dynamic shifts from manipulation to self-governance. Detaching with dignity is one of the most misunderstood forms of strength. Many believe power is loud. They believe strength is confrontation. They believe victory is proving someone wrong. But in a control-based dynamic, the most devastating response is emotional independence. when you stop explaining yourself repeatedly, when you stop chasing resolution that never arrives, when you stop arguing to be understood by someone committed to misunderstanding you. That is detachment with dignity. Detachment does not mean you stop caring. It means you stop over-functioning. It means you stop carrying responsibility for someone else's emotional immaturity. It means you refuse to participate in cycles designed to exhaust you. Dignity is the calm refusal to engage in chaos. It is the steady posture of someone who knows their worth without demanding validation for it. When an empath learns this, transformation begins. The nervous system calms. The constant anticipation of mood shifts disappears. The need to over-explain fades. You start making decisions based on peace rather than fear of reaction. And that is liberation. Because the greatest prison in a narcissistic dynamic is not physical. It is psychological. It is the belief that you must manage someone else's ego to maintain stability. Once you detach with dignity, you remove the reinforcement that sustained control. The narcissistic personality may escalate. They may provoke. They may attempt charm. They may rewrite narratives. But all of these responses have one goal: restore emotional access. When that access is denied, the structure weakens further. The empath's power was never in emotional sacrifice. It was in emotional intelligence. And emotional intelligence, when paired with boundaries, becomes unshakable. Walking away is not abandonment. It is self-alignment. It is choosing internal order over external approval. It is recognizing that peace is not something someone gives you. It is something you protect. In the end, control collapses when it is no longer fed. Validation loses its power when it is no longer begged for. And dignity becomes the loudest statement you will ever make without raising your voice at all. Control is often mistaken for love by those who have never experienced secure identity. Many people believe that intense attention, constant checking, possessiveness, or emotional dependency are signs of deep affection. But control is not love. Control is fear disguised as attachment. It is the fear of losing influence, the fear of being exposed, and the fear of being insignificant. In unhealthy psychological dynamics, especially where narcissistic tendencies exist, control becomes the central emotional need. The individual does not seek connection for mutual growth. They seek it for dominance. They do not ask, how can I serve this relationship? They ask, often unconsciously, how can I secure my position of power? Love liberates. Control restricts. Love trusts. Control monitors. Love builds identity in both people. Control erodes identity in one to preserve ego in the other. This is why emotional reactions become so valuable to a controlling personality. Your tears, your anger, your attempts to explain yourself, your desire to fix the relationship, all of it confirms their influence. As long as you respond intensely, they feel significant. When control is the primary need, peace becomes threatening because peace cannot be manipulated. Silence becomes dangerous because silence cannot be steered. And independence becomes intolerable because independence cannot be owned. Understanding this distinction is crucial. Once you recognize that what you were experiencing was not love, but a system of control, you stop internalizing blame. You begin to see that the conflict was never about your worth, but about their need for dominance. And when control is no longer granted, the very structure of their emotional stability begins to shake. Boundaries are not walls built to punish others. They are structures built to protect identity. Many empaths struggle with boundaries because they confuse them with rejection. They believe that saying no means being unkind. They believe that distancing themselves means abandoning someone in need. But boundaries are not about cruelty, they are about clarity. A boundary says, I understand who I am, and I understand what I will and will not accept. Without boundaries, empathy turns into self-neglect. You begin to overextend, overgive, over-explain, and overcompensate. The more you give without limits, the more you silently teach others that access to you is unlimited. Healthy boundaries shift the entire psychological equation. They interrupt manipulation. They slow down emotional chaos. They expose entitlement. When you calmly state what you require and consistently enforce it, you communicate self-respect without aggression. And self-respect is deeply unsettling to someone who relies on emotional control. Boundaries remove unpredictability from your reactions. They replace emotional drama with firm consistency. Instead of arguing, you disengage. Instead of defending yourself repeatedly, you clarify once and step back. Instead of chasing validation, you validate yourself. This shift does not happen overnight. It requires awareness, courage, and discipline. But once established, boundaries transform empathy from vulnerability into strength. You no longer pour from an empty place. You no longer negotiate your dignity for temporary peace. You stand in calm authority over your emotional space. And in doing so, You redefine the relationship dynamic. The person who once relied on your limitless tolerance now faces your steady resolve. That steady resolve is far more powerful than emotional confrontation. When emotional supply is removed, the internal consequences for a control-driven personality can be profound. Emotional supply is the constant flow of validation, reaction, admiration, or even conflict that sustains their sense of self. Without it, the ego has nothing to anchor itself to. It is important to understand that the narcissistic ego often appears grand, confident, and untouchable. But beneath that exterior is a fragile structure built on external reinforcement. When the empath walks away and refuses to engage, that reinforcement disappears. The silence forces reflection. The absence of reaction creates uncertainty. The loss of influence generates anxiety. This is where psychological discomfort intensifies. They may attempt to regain control through charm, guilt, provocation, or reputation attacks. These are not random behaviors. They are attempts to restore supply. Without supply, they experience what feels like internal collapse. The mirror that once reflected their power is gone. They are left alone with insecurities they worked hard to avoid. This is why detachment is so powerful. It does not attack. It does not argue. It simply withdraws energy. And without energy, manipulation cannot function. The empath, on the other hand, begins a different journey. While the other struggles with the absence of control, the empath learns the presence of peace. There may be initial grief, doubt, or loneliness, but gradually clarity replaces confusion, confidence replaces anxiety, stability replaces chaos. Removing emotional supply does not destroy a person, it removes the illusion they built around themselves. And in that removal, truth is revealed. One person confronts inner emptiness. The other discovers inner freedom. When emotional supply is removed from a narcissistic dynamic, the shift is not merely relational. It is psychological, neurological, and deeply destabilizing for the one who depended on it. To understand this, you must first recognize that what many people call love in such relationships is often a system of emotional exchange built on imbalance. The empath gives affirmation, reassurance, attention, forgiveness, and emotional responsiveness. The narcissistic personality, in return, gives inconsistency, control, and conditional approval. The entire structure survives on one critical ingredient: supply. Supply is not just praise, it is reaction. It is your explanations, your tears, your arguments, your attempts to prove yourself, your effort to fix what you did not break. Every time you defend yourself, you are feeding the need for significance. Every time you try to make them understand, you are confirming their centrality. Every time you remain engaged in the emotional chaos, you are reinforcing their psychological dominance. Now observe what happens when that supply is removed. Silence replaces reaction. Distance replaces pursuit. Calm detachment replaces emotional volatility. The empath, who once carried the emotional weight of the relationship, decides to stop participating in the cycle. And when that happens, the narcissistic structure begins to tremble. Why? Because narcissistic ego is externally regulated. It does not generate stability from within, it extracts stability from outside. Without someone reflecting importance back to them, they experience an internal vacuum. The removal of supply forces them into a confrontation with inadequacy, insecurity, and fragility they have long avoided. That confrontation feels like psychological chaos. They may respond with sudden charm, dramatic apologies, or intense declarations of love. This is not necessarily transformation, it is often survival instinct. When charm fails, they may switch to aggression. When aggression fails, they may attempt character assassination. All of these behaviors have one objective: re-establish emotional connection, regain relevance, restore supply. Understand this deeply. Indifference is more threatening than anger. Anger proves you still care. Indifference signals closure, and closure removes their leverage. When emotional supply disappears, the narcissist may experience anxiety, rage, obsession, or impulsive attempts to replace you quickly. Replacement is not healing, it is substitution. They seek another mirror to reflect admiration back to them. But the original disruption remains unresolved because the root issue was never you. The root issue was dependency on external validation. Now let us move deeper into the internal collapse of ego when validation disappears. Ego, in its healthy form, is simply identity awareness. But in its distorted form, it becomes a defense mechanism, a constructed persona designed to hide vulnerability. The narcissistic ego is not strength, it is armor. It is built carefully, layer upon layer, to protect a fragile self-image from exposure. Validation acts as reinforcement for that armor. Compliments strengthen it. Fear strengthens it. Attention strengthens it. Even conflict strengthens it. But when validation stops completely, cracks begin to form. Without constant reinforcement, the grandiose self-image weakens. The The person may feel unseen, unimportant, or irrelevant. This is why the loss of an empath can feel catastrophic. The empath was not just a partner, they were a mirror. They reflected admiration, emotional energy, and responsiveness. They made the narcissist feel significant. When that mirror is removed, the narcissist faces something unfamiliar: internal silence. And internal silence is dangerous to someone who has avoided self-reflection. This silence can trigger profound discomfort. Restlessness increases. The need to prove superiority intensifies. Social media activity may spike as they attempt to showcase success or happiness. Why? Because validation must be restored quickly to prevent ego collapse. But here is the educational truth. If a personality depends entirely on external affirmation for stability, it lacks internal grounding. True confidence is self-sustained. It does not require constant applause. When applause becomes oxygen, suffocation begins the moment it stops. The empath's withdrawal, therefore, becomes a mirror of reality. It reveals that the control was never absolute. It exposes that admiration was conditional. It proves that emotional dominance can be revoked. That realization destabilizes the ego structure. Some individuals, when faced with this destabilization, may begin a path of introspection. But many double down on denial. They may rewrite the narrative, convincing themselves you were the problem. They may project their insecurity outward. Projection is easier than self-examination, yet internally the loss registers. Because what truly creates psychological is not punishment. It is emptiness. When you no longer respond, they lose the script. When you no longer defend, they lose the argument. When you no longer chase, they lose the illusion of superiority. And in that loss, the ego is forced to confront its artificial foundation. For the empath, this stage may look chaotic from the outside, but internally, something different is happening. While the narcissist struggles with instability, the empath begins stabilizing. Emotional energy once spent on managing someone else becomes available for self-growth. Anxiety reduces. Clarity increases. Identity strengthens. The removal of supply does not just destabilize one person, it liberates the other. And this is the deeper lesson: when validation disappears, false structures collapse. But what is authentic survives. If your peace depends on controlling someone else, you will suffer when they leave. If your identity depends on someone else's reaction, you will panic when they detach. But if your worth is rooted internally, no departure can destroy you. The empath's walk away is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of restoration. And in that restoration, the imbalance that once empowered manipulation dissolves. What feels like psychological torment to one is simply the natural consequence of dependency being exposed. And what feels like loss to the other becomes the beginning of self-possession. When the empath walks away, the first thing that collapses is not the relationship. It is the illusion of control. You must understand something deeply educational about narcissistic psychology. Control is not a preference for them, it is a survival mechanism. Their emotional structure is built on external reinforcement. They do not regulate themselves internally, they regulate themselves through reactions. Your tears regulate them. Your explanations regulate them. Your attempts to fix things regulate them. Even your anger regulates them. As long as you respond, they feel significant. As long as you engage, they feel powerful. But the moment you withdraw your emotional participation, you remove the system that was stabilizing their fragile ego. That is why walking away creates internal chaos for them. It disrupts the psychological economy they were living on. Control, for a narcissistic personality, is mistaken for love. They interpret your tolerance as loyalty, your forgiveness as weakness, and your empathy as permission. The empath often stays longer than they should because they believe understanding someone will heal them. But understanding without boundaries does not heal dysfunction. It enables it. When the empath finally recognizes that their compassion has become a tool for manipulation, something shifts internally. They begin to see that love without respect is not love at all. And when they choose to walk away, they are not abandoning someone, they are withdrawing consent from emotional exploitation. This is where the narcissist begins to feel psychological instability, because what they truly depended on was not love, it was access. The silent power of boundaries is something many empaths learn late, but once learned, it transforms everything. A boundary is not an attack, it is a declaration of self-definition. It says, "This is where I end and you begin." For someone who thrives on enmeshment and blurred lines, boundaries feel like rejection. But in reality, boundaries are education. They teach others how to treat you. When the empath finally enforces boundaries consistently, not with rage, not with drama, but with calm finality, the narcissist experiences something unfamiliar: consequences. and consequences are terrifying to someone who believed they were untouchable. Understand this principle clearly. Boundaries expose character. When you say no and someone responds with respect, you have encountered maturity. When you say no and someone responds with manipulation, rage, or guilt tripping, you have encountered insecurity. The narcissist often reacts intensely to boundaries because boundaries limit their influence. And influence is their addiction. So when the empath walks away without negotiation, without begging, without returning to explain again, the narcissist is forced to face a reality they cannot control. That loss of control feels like psychological suffocation. Now consider what truly happens when emotional supply is removed. Emotional supply is the attention, admiration, reaction, and validation that feeds the narcissistic ego. Without it, their self-image begins to shake. They may attempt to regain supply through hoovering, sudden apologies, grand promises, or dramatic confessions. They may try to provoke you, hoping anger will pull you back into engagement. They may attempt to damage your reputation to trigger a defensive reaction. These behaviors are not random. They are strategic attempts to re-establish connection. Because connection, even negative, restores their sense of relevance. But when the empath remains silent and grounded, something extraordinary happens. The narcissist is left alone with their own unprocessed emotions. And here lies the educational truth. Many narcissistic tendencies develop as defense mechanisms against deep insecurity and shame. As long as someone else is present to distract, affirm, or battle them, they never have to confront that insecurity. But when the empath leaves, the distraction leaves with them. The mirror disappears. The applause ends. The conflict ceases. And in that quiet, unresolved issues surface. This is why indifference is more powerful than confrontation. Anger still signals emotional investment, but indifference communicates detachment. It says, "You no longer have access to my internal world." That message destabilizes someone who built their identity around controlling that access. They begin to question their desirability, their power, their importance. And because their self-worth is externally constructed, they may scramble to replace you quickly. Not because they have healed, but because they need new supply. Meanwhile, the empath undergoes a different transformation. Walking away forces them to redirect energy inward. Instead of analyzing the narcissist's behavior, they begin examining their own patterns. Why they tolerated disrespect, why they overextended themselves, why they equated suffering with loyalty. This reflection leads to growth, growth leads to strength, and strength changes future choices. So while one person experiences psychological unrest, the other experiences psychological expansion. One confronts emptiness. The other discovers identity. One seeks replacement. The other builds resilience. Walking away, therefore, is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of clarity. It restores emotional balance. It reclaims dignity. It breaks cycles of manipulation not through force, but through absence. And absence, when applied with wisdom, is a powerful teacher. The internal collapse of the ego when validation disappears is not dramatic on the outside at first. It is subtle, psychological, and deeply destabilizing. A narcissistic personality is constructed like a building with a polished exterior but a hollow interior. The structure looks confident, commanding, even superior. But that structure is not self-sustaining. It depends on constant emotional reinforcement from others. Every compliment, every reaction, every argument, every attempt to explain yourself, all of it becomes psychological fuel. When the empath walks away, that fuel line is cut. What many people fail to understand is that the narcissistic ego is not true confidence. True confidence is self-generated. It is stable whether people clap or criticize. But ego that is built on external validation must constantly be fed. It needs to be admired, feared, chased, or emotionally engaged with. When that engagement stops, silence begins to expose insecurity. The mind begins to race. Questions emerge that were previously drowned out by noise. Why did they leave? Why can't I control this? Why am I not being pursued? These questions are not about love. They are about lost power. The disappearance of validation feels like psychological starvation. The narcissist may attempt to recreate the supply by provoking a reaction. They might send a message designed to trigger guilt. They may attempt to create jealousy. They may criticize you publicly or privately. These are not random behaviors. They are attempts to restore emotional control. Because when someone no longer reacts, the illusion of superiority begins to crack. There is a reason indifference unsettles a narcissistic personality more than anger. Anger is engagement. Anger proves you still care. But calm detachment, that signals independence. And independence removes leverage. When the empath becomes emotionally self-sufficient, the narcissist confronts a terrifying reality. They are no longer the center of someone's emotional universe. Internally, this creates instability. Without validation, the fragile self-image begins to shake. The exaggerated sense of importance loses its reinforcement. The narrative of dominance loses its audience. And when the audience leaves, the performance collapses. That collapse feels like psychological hell because it forces an encounter with unresolved insecurity. The empath, on the other hand, often misinterprets this moment. They assume that walking away means losing. They may feel guilt, doubt, or even loneliness. But what they are actually doing is removing themselves from a cycle of dependency. When you stop feeding dysfunction, dysfunction begins to weaken. That weakening may look chaotic at first, emotional outbursts, manipulation attempts, sudden affection, but it is simply the system trying to survive. The ego that relied on your presence must now face its own emptiness. And emptiness is uncomfortable when you have never learned to build inner substance. That discomfort becomes restlessness. Restlessness becomes anger. Anger becomes blame. Blame becomes campaigns to regain control. But none of those strategies can replace what was lost. The steady stream of affirmation that kept the fragile identity intact. This is why the most powerful act an empath can perform is quiet consistency. No reaction, no retaliation, no need to prove a point. Emotional neutrality becomes strength. It says, I am no longer available for manipulation. It says, my value is not dependent on your perception. And that statement, whether spoken or silent, removes the final pillar supporting the inflated ego. When validation disappears, the narcissist is left with self-reflection, something they have often avoided. Without external applause, internal criticism grows louder. Without someone to control, they must confront their own lack of control. The psychological tension intensifies because the identity they presented to the world is no longer being confirmed. Meanwhile, the empath begins to experience something unfamiliar but powerful clarity. When you step out of emotional chaos, your mind stabilizes. When you detach from manipulation, your perception sharpens. You begin to see patterns you once excused. You begin to understand that what felt like love was often control disguised as affection. That awareness strengthens your boundaries. Boundaries are not punishments. They are psychological fences protecting your well-being. And when you enforce them without hostility, you communicate maturity. The narcissist may interpret that maturity as rejection or betrayal because they equate access with entitlement. But access is a privilege, not a right. The collapse of ego is not instant destruction, it is gradual exposure. Every day without validation reveals the instability beneath the surface. Every day without emotional reaction weakens the old dynamic. And the longer you remain detached, the more permanent your freedom becomes. This is not about causing suffering. It is about ending unhealthy cycles. When you stop participating in dysfunction, the system either evolves or disintegrates. If the individual lacks the capacity for introspection, they will experience turmoil. If they possess self-awareness, they may grow. But your responsibility is not to manage their growth. Your responsibility is to protect your peace. When validation disappears, illusion fades. And when illusion fades, truth stands exposed. The narcissist may call it abandonment. They may call it cruelty. But what it truly is the removal of artificial reinforcement. And when artificial reinforcement is gone, only reality remains. For the empath who walks away, that reality becomes liberation. For the narcissist who depended on constant validation, that reality becomes confrontation. One experiences collapse, the other experiences clarity. And clarity is the foundation of lasting strength. To truly understand the dynamic between an empath and a narcissistic personality, you must first understand the psychological architecture behind both. An empath is naturally attuned to the emotional climate of others. They sense shifts in tone, subtle disappointments, unspoken pain, and even hidden insecurities. Their strength lies in connection, compassion, and the desire to heal. However, without awareness, this sensitivity can become overextension. On the other hand, a narcissistic personality structure is built not on genuine self-worth, but on fragile ego reinforcement. It seeks admiration, attention, and emotional reaction to stabilize an unstable internal identity. Where the empath gives energy to build connection, the narcissist often extracts energy to maintain control. This difference creates a cycle. One gives to create harmony, the other takes to preserve dominance. Until the empath becomes conscious of this imbalance. They may confuse emotional exhaustion with love. It is essential to recognize that control, not love, is the central emotional need of a narcissistic system. Love requires mutuality, vulnerability, and accountability. Control requires dominance, unpredictability, and emotional leverage. When a narcissistic individual senses that they can influence your moods, dictate your reactions, or cause you to chase their approval, they feel secure. That sense of control gives them psychological stability. The empath, wanting peace, often complies, reassures, explains, and forgives repeatedly. Yet every time they over-explain or overcompensate, the imbalance deepens. The narcissistic mindset interprets accommodation as confirmation of superiority. Therefore, what the empath believes is compassion may unintentionally become reinforcement of unhealthy power dynamics. Understanding this distinction is critical because it reveals why walking away disrupts the entire system. Boundaries are the silent revolution of an awakened empath. A boundary is not anger. It is not hostility. It is clarity about where you end and another person begins. When an empath finally understands that self-respect must accompany compassion, something shifts internally. They stop negotiating their worth. They stop justifying their needs. They stop shrinking to maintain temporary peace. Boundaries communicate value without shouting. And this quiet firmness is unsettling to someone accustomed to emotional access without limits. The narcissistic personality depends on predictable reactions, emotional pleas, frustration, attempts to fix the situation. But when boundaries are established calmly and consistently, the manipulative patterns lose effectiveness. The empath's growth does not involve becoming cold. It involves becoming anchored. That anchoring transforms vulnerability into strength. When emotional supply is removed, the psychological consequences for a narcissistic personality can be profound. Emotional supply refers to attention, admiration, reaction, and engagement. Whether positive or negative, this supply confirms relevance and power. When an empath withdraws their emotional availability, the narcissistic system experiences instability. Silence replaces argument. Indifference replaces pursuit. This creates internal tension because the external mirror that once reflected importance is gone. The narcissist may attempt various strategies to restore equilibrium: charm, guilt, provocation, or even public narratives designed to regain attention. These actions are not necessarily driven by affection. They are attempts to restore lost control. Without supply, the inflated self-image begins to crack, revealing insecurity beneath the surface. What feels like psychological distress is often the collapse of a carefully constructed illusion. The collapse of ego when validation disappears exposes a critical truth. Dependence on external affirmation is fragile. A narcissistic identity structure requires continuous reinforcement. When admiration stops, when chasing stops, when emotional intensity stops, the internal emptiness becomes more noticeable. The empath, once the primary source of affirmation, becomes absent. This absence is not simply physical, it is psychological. The narcissist can no longer rely on predictable reassurance. This forces an uncomfortable confrontation with unresolved insecurities. While not every narcissistic personality responds with introspection, the disruption itself creates inner turmoil. The very stability they projected outwardly begins to feel uncertain. The empath's departure becomes a mirror reflecting what was avoided internally. Walking away is not merely an exit from a relationship, it is an act of leadership over one's identity. Many empaths struggle with guilt when considering separation because they equate endurance with loyalty. However, endurance without mutual respect erodes self-worth. Choosing to walk away requires courage because it involves tolerating temporary loneliness in exchange for long-term peace. It is a declaration that personal dignity is more valuable than chaotic attachment. This decision signals emotional maturity. It communicates that empathy will no longer function without reciprocity. Leadership begins with self-governance, the ability to manage one's emotions, protect one's values, and choose alignment over approval. In this sense, walking away is not retaliation, it is responsibility for one's psychological well-being. Finally, pain becomes transformative when it is redirected toward growth. The empath, who once overextended, learns discernment. The emotional energy once spent stabilizing another person can now be invested in purpose, creativity, and healthier relationships. Emotional freedom emerges when validation is no longer sought from someone incapable of giving it authentically. The experience, though painful, becomes educational. It teaches that compassion must include self-compassion. It teaches that boundaries are not barriers to love, but safeguards of it. And most importantly, it teaches that identity cannot be anchored in someone else's approval. When an empath walks away, they do not simply leave a person behind. They leave behind a version of themselves that tolerated less than they deserved. That evolution marks the beginning of genuine empowerment. The narcissist may experience psychological unrest, but you experience psychological liberation. And liberation is always more powerful than control. Remember this: the day an empath learns to walk away is the day their life truly begins.